making your way in your Bibles over to 1 Kings chapter 7. 1 Kings chapter 7 is where our study is going to be taken from tonight. And we're going to talk about Solomon building his house and getting some of the furnishings made for the temple of God. Last week we read about the temple itself and, of course, how Solomon was responsible for building that house of God, something that his father David wanted to do, but of course was not allowed to by God. But God did tell David that his son Solomon would be able to do such. And so tonight we're going to read about Solomon's own house that he builds for himself. And then again, the end of the chapter, the latter part of the chapter, really the majority of the chapter, deals with the furnishings that are going to be put within the temple. Question number one on your sheet is kind of set the pace, I guess, for tonight, or the idea. But the question is, what do you think of when you hear the word palace? Now, this is a word that's going to be referred to as the place where Solomon dwelt. And obviously, many times when you read about a king in the Bible, they build the palace. So what do you think of when you hear the word palace? Okay, royalty. That would be one of the first things that would come to mind. What else?
Extravagant.
Yeah, extravagant, right? Above normal, we might say. Different from most, if not everything else. What's another word that comes to mind? Expensive, okay. What about size? What do you think of when you hear palace?
Large.
Yeah, you don't think of something, 8x8 room out here somewhere, right? You think of something that's really, really big. So big would be something that would come to mind. Size, extravagant, eloquent. What else? Anything else pop into your mind? What do you think of about a person who would live in a palace? If somebody said, "This is my palace," Steve said royalty is one of the things that come to mind. Power, okay. Ego, yeah. I mean, sometimes when you think of, we might even say a mansion, today. Well, who builds a mansion? Rich people, yeah. Yeah, rich people, obviously, and a lot of times those people like to show how much money they have, right? By the things that they buy and the things that they build and the things that they wear. Anything else come to mind? I think that was about all of them that I had written down here. So basically, you kind of got this idea, the characteristics that we would associate with a palace, and even some of the characteristics of a person who might live within that palace. Let's go over to 1 Kings chapter 7, and somebody read for us the first 12 verses there, please. We're not going to read all this chapter, but these first 12 we want to spend a little time on.
Cedar
the inner courts of the house of the Lord and the vestibule of the temple.
Okay, if you remember, as we ended in chapter 6, the last couple verses kind of give us a chronological time frame of the building of the temple of God. And in verse 37 back in chapter 6, it says, "In the 4th year the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid in the month of Ziv, and in the 11th year in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all its detail and according to all its plans. So he was 7 years in building it." And notice verse 1 in chapter 7, "But Solomon took 13 years to build his own house, so he finished all his house." So what you have is kind of a contrast from the building of the temple of God to the building of Solomon's house. And so question number 2 on your sheet is, how long did it take to complete Solomon's palace? 13 years, in contrast to how many with the temple? Okay, 7 years to build the temple. And if you look at some of the numbers, you know, Solomon's palace was about twice as large as the temple itself. So it kind of makes sense that it took, you know, twice the amount of time to build Solomon's house that it would have built the temple. It was the same height also. Remember that the temple was 45 feet high. Solomon's house probably had, you know, reading about the windows there, it probably had a 2nd story and probably even a 3rd story also. So just common sense would tell you it would take you longer to build a structure like that than it would the temple itself. Question number 3. So what were some of the structures? We read about several of them, but what were some of the structures that Solomon built? What's the obvious one? Temple. Okay, we'll start with obvious, right? Work our way up. What else?
Porches.
Yeah, actually 2 porches that he built that we read about here. What else do you read about him building?
Built a couple houses for himself, and he started for wives, it looks like.
Yeah, he had his own house, and then he built his wife a house. He built a throne room that we read about there. It's not what it's called in the scripture, but that's basically what it would be, a place where Solomon would sit on his throne. He built a reception hall, you know, a place where banquets would be held. The throne room would probably have been a place of judgment, a place where court officials would have met, judgment would have been passed. And, you know, when you read it, it kind of reads like he built, you know, all these different houses, but I think we're actually reading of, it was in a sense a separate structure, but really they were all attached to each other. And so, you know, Solomon didn't live in his own house and his wife lived in a different house. They were attached, and even remember the temple itself was attached to the house of Solomon with like a walkway. So a lot of these structures that we read about, I think we're actually reading about Solomon building his house. These were the different compartments that were built within his house itself. Question number 4 is, of all these buildings that Solomon built, which one was completed first?
The temple.
Yeah, the temple of God was the first building that Solomon set out and built and completed. Now, remember that when we read about the beginning of it, it was into the 4th year of Solomon's reign before the temple began to be built. And so I think it took about 4 years for Solomon to gather all these resources and all these people and, you know, get the plans and everything and everybody on the same page before this temple was started being built. But it started in the 4th year of his reign. It was finished in the 11th year of his reign. So 7 years he took, and that was the first of all these buildings which were completed. Now, it kind of brings up an interesting question here, number 5, because you probably heard the discussion or maybe even been involved in the discussion before of, well, did Solomon have his priorities right? You know, because he only took 7 years to build the temple, but he took 13 years to build his own house. And so this is kind of a good discussion question, but the question is, do you think, not right or wrong here, but do you think that Solomon had his priorities in order or not?
I think it's likely he put a ton of those resources towards finishing the temple, is why his house grew out longer. Maybe they're going on at the same time, I'm assuming. Put a bunch of resources to the temple and then started diverting elsewhere once it's complete.
Well, that's one theory that some people have. Turn over to 1 Kings chapter 9 with me real quickly here. Let's read a couple of verses. And I found this one kind of interesting because it kind of gives you a little bit more perspective of how these events transpired. But in 1 Kings chapter 9 and verse 10, it said, "Now it happened at the end of 20 years, when Solomon had built the two houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house." So it wasn't that these two things were going on at the same time. It was 20 years that it took him to build these two houses. 7 were dedicated to the temple, then 13 were dedicated to him building his own house. So what that tells me is the first thing that Solomon did was dedicate all of his time and his resources to the building of the temple. 7 years it took him to do that. Then 13 years after that, 13 years it took him to build his own house. And so 20 years it took Solomon to build those two houses. It says the house of the Lord and his house there in 1 Kings 9 and verse 10. So does that give a little bit different perspective of it maybe?
Maybe he didn't have the number of craftsmen to build his house that he did for the temple.
Okay. So
Not all those people wanted to spend 20 years building, probably.
well, I imagine they did whatever the king told them to do.
Yeah, but some of them probably died.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, 20 years is a long time to build, isn't it? So it probably switched generations pretty close. Yeah.
I thought it referenced somewhere at the end of it that Hiram, that Solomon gave a reward of so many cities. He was displeased with this, but I thought in there it mentioned the reward was for helping him complete the temple and his palaces, all of it.
Yeah.
So I had in my mind that this sort of same process was in the mix throughout all that construction, but maybe not.
Well, like I said, I think 1 Kings 9:10 to me kind of, clarified what the time frame, because it says it took him 20 years to build those two houses. And so we read about 7 years that it took to build the temple, and then the 13 years that it took him to build his own house. So to me, that's an indication that he didn't start building his own house until he finished building the temple. That was his first project. But you are right. There was a little later on we'll read about Hiram, and basically, Hiram kind of gave him a loan, and Solomon, I guess, traded those cities as collateral until he could pay Hiram back. That's kind of guaranteed for the resources that he provided. Are you aware of a specific verse there?
I'm just out of memory. I just
Yeah.
remember reading that that was what he gave him. I thought he gave it to him that was like payment. He wasn't happy with it. He called him dirty or something.
Yeah, he didn't like him. Yeah, he didn't like him at all. But that was a little later on we read about Solomon buying those back. So it was more of a guarantee that he was going to get the money back, I think. Anyway, to come up with a particular verse, we'll look at it, and I'm not aware. I'm like you. Sometimes I can remember stuff, but I can't pinpoint exactly where they were.
They're just on down from in chapter 9, verse 13.
Okay.
Well, yeah, but, yeah, I mean, those are given to the cities, and he did not please him, verse 12.
Yeah. I think he was referencing a particular time period, though, weren't you? To the building of the two houses that he had in mind. Anyway, if somebody comes up with something, you can holler at me and we'll look at it.
As far as priority, earlier in that same chapter 9, God's talking to Solomon, and it says it's a consecrated house, and it seems to be pleased, like 700 verses. Direction, of course, it gives a warning, do right, everything will go good, don't go bad. I can't imagine that his priorities have been wrong. God would have said all these things to him at the end of his 20-year period.
Yeah, and that's kind of my take on it. I think, again, some commentators, and I've heard discussions in classes before where people were like, well, he only dedicated 7 years to building the temple and 13 to his own, so he's being selfish. He put himself before God. But when you think about the temple, where did Solomon get the plans for the temple? God gave him the plan. So however long it took to build it is how long it took to build it, right? And when you think about all the materials that were involved in it, the craftsmanship, did Solomon skimp in any way when it came to building the temple? No. If anything, I think he went out of his way to make sure that everything was perfect. And so I don't think there's any indication, that he didn't do things right, or that his priorities were out of whack. I kind of pointed out in the beginning, if you look at the dimensions, his house was almost twice as big as the temple, and it probably had a second and a third story on it too. So, it was an extravagant house. Don't misunderstand me. It wasn't, just a normal house. But the fact that it was twice as big as the temple would indicate it would take twice as long for a person to build it. Yeah.
There was a whole lot of things that were there besides just bedroom.
Yeah, it wasn't. A lot of the amenities in it wasn't just for Solomon to enjoy. It was the court. Yeah, as part of the government. There was we read about the hall, that's decorated with the golden shields, and there were all kinds of things for the higher officials of the country itself. There was part of the house, of course, that was dedicated for his wife, right? The set apart building it for her. Probably what took so long, but yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
You sure run your own on that one.
My wife's not in here tonight.
Are you saying he had to redo that?
Maybe. Maybe. Turn over to the book of Haggai real quickly. There is a condemnation that was given to the children of Israel, kind of contrast between the building of God's house and the building of their own house, as it's found a little later on in Israel's history in the book of Haggai. And turn over to Haggai, let's see, getting the right book here. Haggai chapter 1, and beginning in verse 2, it says, "Thus speaks the Lord of hosts, saying, This people says, the time has not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. Then the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet, saying, Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses, and this temple to lie in ruins? Now therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways." You read about a time in the history of the children of Israel when they returned back from captivity, and one of the things that they had to do was rebuild everything. What was the first thing that they rebuilt? Their own houses. Yeah, they laid the foundation of the temple, but then they said, we got to build our own houses, And so they were busy building their own, and then the temple here was God's house, and it was just sitting there with the foundation. And so God appeals to his people through the prophet Haggai, and he said, you've got these houses that are paneled, they're all sealed up and all fancy, and then look at my house over here. So there was a condemnation for the people putting themselves before God, but I don't think that's the story of Solomon at all. I think, in fact, we're reading the very opposite, where Solomon builds this temple, this house of God first, and then he builds his own house. So, in my estimation, I don't think his priorities were out of whack. I think he did exactly what God wanted him to do. I think he dedicated the proper time, the proper materials, craftsmanship to the temple, and then he turned his attention to building his own house, and there's really nothing in the scripture that indicates that God was displeased with his actions in any way. Does anybody have any thoughts or disagreements? Yes, sir.
I've seen pictures of what these people think this looked like. It looked like that Solomon's house was surrounded temple.
Yeah.
Is that what you think that's?
I don't know that it completely surrounded it, but the first thing you'd see is Solomon's house. I mean, just because of the size of it, it was double the size, but it would have dwarfed the temple. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And exactly how it was arranged, I don't think we could know for sure. But like you said, there are some people who believe that it was kind of surrounding circumventing, we could say, or going around the temple itself. The only thing we do know for sure is the temple was attached to his house in some way. Okay, any questions or comments or anything? Yes, sir.
Was there a commandment that he had to build the temple first from God?
I don't think we read of anything like that.
To me, that ends the argument there about priorities.
Yeah.
Because he could have built this huge mansion first, instead of 7 years building his mansion and then 13 after. And I still think priorities would have been backwards versus 7 build the mansion or build the temple. Because he built the mansion or the temple first, and that to me that's the right priority.
Yeah, I think, like I said, to me, that's everything that I can read in Scripture that indicates that's the way that it happened. Like Wes talked about too, indicates that God was happy with what he did too. Okay, let's go to the next section here. We're not going to read all verses 13 through 22, but we do want to read a couple of passages. If we can, get somebody to read verses 13 and 14 here in 1 Kings 7.
King Solomon sent and fetched Hiram out of Tyre. He was a widow's son of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in brass, and he was filled with wisdom and understanding, and cunning to work all works in brass. And he came to King Solomon and wrought all his works.
Okay, so question number 8 is, what was notable about the man that Solomon brought from Tyre? He was kind of the head craftsman over the project. What was famous about him?
His bronze work.
Yeah, he was he was highly skilled. Not only in bronze, but in Second Chronicles we read in all metals. He was highly skilled as a craftsman in all kinds of metals, and not only in metals but also in fabrics. He was an expert in fabrics too. And so the man that we're reading about here in verse 13, I think the King James Version translates it as Hiram. Some of the other versions translates it as Huram to kind of designate that it's a different person. But it's not the king of Tyre that we're reading about here, but a person within Israel. His mother was an Israelite. His father was a Phoenician, and evidently he'd learned some of this craftsman from his father, and a very skilled person in those areas. So he was instrumental in a lot of the construction of the temple and in Solomon's house itself. Question number 9 here. It says, what were the names that were given to the pillars of the temple? He built these 2 pillars. I think they were, what were they, 27 feet tall? Yeah, and it's interesting how it describes it, because basically as this pillar is going up, it changes images all throughout. Part of it looks like it's pomegranates stacked up on each other. Part of it looks like chains that are wrapped around going up. And what were some of the others? Yeah. Part of it was lilies, looked like flowers that were stacked up. So when you looked at it, it was amazing in and of itself, the size, but it looked like it was all these different things that were stacked on top of one another that was holding up the porch on the temple. So very, very detailed craftsmanship in the construction of these. But there were 2 names that were given to these pillars. Verse 21, what were those 2 names? Yeah, Jachin and Boaz. And does anybody have a reference in their Bible as to what the meaning of that is? Anybody know right off the top of their head?
How do you pronounce the J word?
Jachin?
Jachin. He shall establish.
Okay, yeah, God will establish. What about Boaz?
In it is strength.
Yeah, or in him is strength, or in God is strength. So they both had to do with the idea of strength, which of course the pillar would support, but they more represented the idea of the support or the strength of God. So that was the name that was given to these 2 extravagant pillars within the temple. Let's go down to verse 23. Somebody read verse 23 through 26 for us. 1 Kings 7.
And he made a sea of cast bronze, 10 cubits from one rim to the other. It was completely round. Its height was 5 12 oxen, 3 looking toward the north, 3 looking toward the west, 3 looking toward the south, and 3 looking toward the east. And the sea was set upon them, and all their back parts pointed inward. It was a handbreadth thick, and its brim was shaped like the brim of a cup, like a lily blossom. It contained 2,000 baths.
Okay, so question number 10 is, what were some of this, or some of the impressive characteristics of this, well, it was called the sea that was made for the temple?
I think we notice the size and what it's made of, but a lot of times I don't think we can truly appreciate how pretty it was. This guy was like Michelangelo of his day. That's how what I'm reading here. He was talented, and this was beautiful stuff. The carvings he was doing in it, not just the fact it was brass or gold. It was the details in it.
Yeah, the sheer size of it, you know, that's I think in part why it was called the sea. I mean, it was it would be like a modern day swimming pool to us. I mean, you read about what were some of the dimensions. It was 15 feet in diameter, 7.5 feet deep, 45 feet in circumference, and it held. Well, it says 2,000 baths. In 2 Chronicles, it talks about 3,000 if it was filled up to the brim. So evidently they didn't keep it completely full all the time. But it's kind of interesting, you know, that again, the sheer size of it would have been immense. But like Adam said, the craftsmanship, the artistry that was involved, you know, the fact that it's set up on 12 bulls. You know, 3 of them were facing north, 3 facing south, 3 facing east, 3 facing west. I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, that had to be something to behold in and of itself. In 2 Chronicles chapter 4, we read about some of these movable baths or movable stands in the next couple verses we're going to look at. But in verse 6, it talks about there, 2 Chronicles 4, he also made 10 lavers and put 5 on the right side and 5 on the left to wash in them such things as they offered for the burnt offering, they would wash in them. But the sea was for the priests to wash in. So this great bath, when it talks about 2,000 or 3,000 baths, it's talking about the fact that it contained enough water where 2,000 priests could have washed in it. The other lavers that we read about were for the washing of the animals, the burnt offerings. There were 10 of them that sat around in the temple. But the sea was used for the priests washing themselves. In question number 11 here, those were the 10 movable stands. We kind of summarized them there, but how does the passage describe the 10 movable stands? You know, if you look through there real quickly, what are some things that stand out about those movable stands? Six feet long, 6 feet wide. They're about 4.5 feet deep. How were they moved? Yeah, wheels. They had 4 bronze wheels. These wheels, each wheel was 15 inches in diameter, and that's the way that they were moved about. But these were the carts, the lavers that were used to move around to wash the animals, the burnt offerings that were used in the sacrificing of the temple itself. Question number 12. What other items were cast from bronze? In verses 38 through 40, you read about several other things. Look at verse 40 particularly.
Basins, the shovels, the ladders,
Yeah, so you read about buckets that were made out of bronze, shovels that were made out of bronze, bowls that were made out of bronze. Why would they need buckets and shovels? What are you doing in the temple?
Sacrifice.
You're sacrificing, right? There'll be a lot of ashes. There'll be a lot of ashes that need taken out. Bowls to wash things in, to catch blood of the animals in to pour out to. So all these, even the utensils that were used in the construction of the temple were made out of metal, and which was very unique in and of itself. If you read in verses 40 through 47, reads about, again, a lot of bronze things that were made. And then let's concentrate on verse 47 here. Somebody read that for us, please. 1 Kings 7:47.
Solomon did not weigh all the articles because there were so many. The weight of the bronze was not determined.
Okay, so the question is, what amount of bronze was used in the construction of the temple?
Undetermined. Undetermined.
We don't know, right? Why don't we know? It was too much. You know, it's just too much to even try to set apart and to try to weigh. So that gives you an idea, you know, about some of the metals that were used in the construction of this building. If you read verses 48 through 51, you read about some of the gold furnishings that Solomon made for the temple. Question 14, the altar of incense, the table of showbread. You know, even the instruments that the priests often used were made of gold. You know, you read about the wick trimmers that were used to trim the candles. Those were made of gold. The snuffers to put out the flames. Those things were made of gold. So a lot of gold that was involved in the construction of the temple. What do you think? Kind of wind it down here, but what kind of impression do you think people would have got? Well, what kind of impression would you have got if you walked into the temple?
We kind of overwhelmed.
Yeah, I mean, you'd be overwhelmed by the value of it. You know, all the metal, all the gold and the silver and the bronze, the craftsmanship. And why do you think that was so important? Remember, God designed this building himself. Why do you think that was so important to God?
Help establish that what God is about, and, you know, we just can't understand all the things that God knows.
Yeah. Is there any way, you know, what is God worth? I mean, you can't put a price on God, can you? I mean, who do you compare God to? There's no one or nothing that you compare him to. That's really, I think, what that temple was designed to impress upon the minds of Israel. You know, just how precious God was, just how highly valued he was, just how different he was from everyone and everything else. And certainly that was the atmosphere that would have been created, you know, in observing the temple, certainly from the outside, but also when inside, if you were to look upon it, see all those different things. So, all right, we're out of time. Anybody have any comments, questions, or anything before we end chapter 7?